Welcome to my YouTube channel Noha Narrative. A warm welcome to all my amazing viewers, especially my audience from United States. I am truly grateful to you have here. On this channel, every story you hear is real and meaningful. Every story shared on this channel is true and personally written by me. Here you will experience powerful, life-changing story presenting in an educational, documentary style that inspire, teach and open new perspective. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's grow, learn and explore the truth together. Thank you so much.
The Millbrook County Fair arrived every summer like an old friend who never stayed long enough. The Ferris wheel rose above the tree line on Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the whole town smelled of fried dough and popcorn and something sweet that you could not quite name but somehow always remembered. Children ran between the stalls in packs, their shoes already dirty, their laughter louder than the brass band playing near the entrance gates. Nolan Pierce had been setting up his cotton candy stall since 5 in the morning. He was not the kind of man who complained about early mornings. He had a daughter to feed, a stall to run, and exactly enough energy to do both if he kept moving. His hands worked quickly, wrapping the pale pink sugar clouds around their paper sticks with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this every summer for 4 years. Rosie, his 7-year-old, sat on a small folding chair behind the stall with a book open on her lap, though she spent more time watching the fairground fill up with people than she did reading. "Daddy, that man has a hat shaped like a chicken," she said, pointing. "Don't point, sweetheart. But it is literally shaped like a chicken." "I know. Still don't point." Rosie lowered her hand and went back to not reading her book. Nolan smiled to himself. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of noticing every small and strange thing in the world. He tucked that thought away carefully, the way you tuck something fragile into a drawer, and kept working. The morning passed in a pleasant blur of small transactions and conversations. Nolan knew most of the people who stopped at his stall. He knew their children's names and their grandparents' names and what flavor they always ordered. That was the thing about a small town. Everything connected to everything else like a web, and if you paid attention, you could feel the whole thing vibrate when something changed. Something changed around 11 o'clock. A woman out of place. Vivienne Hart stepped through the entrance gate of the Millbrook County Fair the way a storm front moves across a flat plain. You felt her before you saw her. She was tall, in heels that had no business being on fairground grass, wearing a cream blazer that probably cost more than Nolan's stall equipment combined. Her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested she had not left the house without a plan and did not intend to leave this fair without one either. She was on her phone. She was always on her phone. "No, tell them the timeline is not flexible," she said, stepping around a family with a stroller as if they were traffic cones. "I don't care what the county commissioner said. I need that survey report by Friday or the whole deal falls apart." Her assistant, Harriet Cole, walked 2 steps behind her with a tablet pressed to her chest and the expression of a person who had long ago accepted their fate. Harriet was small and efficient and wore sensible shoes, which made her by far the more qualified person to be walking across a fairground. Vivienne had come to Millbrook for one reason. Her company, Hart Property Group, was in the final stages of securing a development deal that would turn a large stretch of land on the town's eastern edge into a luxury mixed-use complex. The fair sat on part of that land. She had come to assess the space personally, because Vivienne Hart did not trust anyone else's eyes but her own. She did not come to buy cotton candy. The collision happened so fast that neither of them fully understood what had occurred until it was already over. Vivienne was turning from her phone call toward Harriet to issue some instruction, stepping sideways without looking, and her elbow caught the edge of Nolan's display tower. The tower was a simple thing, a tall pole with rings of cotton candy wound around it in careful spirals of pink and blue. It tilted. Nolan reached for it. He was not quite fast enough. The entire display came down across Vivienne's front. There was a moment of complete stillness. Then Vivienne looked down at herself. Pink sugar threads clung to her blazer like a sugary spiderweb. A twist of blue cotton candy had landed on her shoulder and was very slowly unraveling down her sleeve. "What," she said flatly, "is this?" "I am so sorry," Nolan said immediately, moving around the stall. "Are you hurt? Let me help." "Help." Vivienne said the word like it was in a foreign language she did not speak. "You want to help? Your product is all over a $4,000 blazer." "I know, and I'm genuinely sorry. If you give me a second, I have some cloth in the back and we can. Do you have any idea what I have scheduled today?" She was pulling cotton candy off her sleeve with 2 fingers, holding each piece away from herself as if it were alive. "I don't," Nolan said calmly, "but I imagine it's important." "It is important. Everything I do is important. This fair, this entire event, is sitting on land that I am in the process of acquiring, and I came here to conduct a professional site visit, not to get covered in children's snacks." Rosie looked up from her book. "It's not just for children," she said helpfully. "Daddy sells it to everyone." Vivienne looked at the small girl. Then back at Nolan. "Is this your child?" "She is," Nolan said, his voice still even. "Then perhaps," Vivienne said, lowering her voice to a precise, cutting tone, "you should be more careful about where you set up your little hobby stall when professional people are trying to work." The word hobby landed in the air between them like something dropped from a height. Nolan did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But something behind his eyes shifted, and Rosie, who knew her father better than anyone in the world, quietly closed her book. "It's not a hobby," he said. "It's how I take care of my daughter. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't use that word in front of her." Vivienne stared at him for a moment. Then she turned to Harriet. "Make a note. This area needs to be cleared before construction begins." She pulled the last thread of cotton candy from her blazer, dropped it on the grass, and walked away without another word. Nolan stood very still. Around him, the fair kept moving, music and laughter and the smell of sugar in the warm summer air. Rosie slipped her small hand into his. "She wasn't very nice," Rosie said. "No," Nolan agreed quietly. "She wasn't." He did not tell his daughter what he was thinking. He did not tell her that the land Vivienne Hart was so certain she was acquiring had belonged to the Pierce family for over 60 years. He did not tell her that he had received a letter from his father's lawyer just 3 days ago, a letter that changed everything he thought he knew about what his family had left behind. He just squeezed Rosie's hand, turned back to his stall, and began rebuilding the display tower, piece by piece, the way he rebuilt everything. Carefully. Quietly. With no intention of being moved. Gerald Pierce had been a lawyer for 38 years, and in that time he had delivered news of many kinds. He had told families about inheritances that made them weep with relief. He had told business partners about debts that made them go pale and silent. He had sat across from people in his small oak-paneled office on Millbrook's Main Street and watched their entire understanding of their own lives shift in the space of a single sentence. He had never delivered news quite like what he carried to Nolan Pierce. The letter had arrived at Nolan's small rented house on a Thursday evening, slipped through the mail slot while Rosie was eating dinner and Nolan was washing dishes. He had almost missed it entirely, assuming it was a bill or a notice from the school. But the envelope was thick and cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp that bore the initials GP, and when he opened it his hands had gone still over the kitchen sink. Gerald requested his presence at the office at his earliest convenience. The matter, the letter said, concerned the estate of Raymond Pierce, Nolan's father, and was of considerable financial significance. Nolan had gone the following morning, leaving Rosie with his neighbor, old Mrs. Tatum, who fed her buttered toast and let her watch cartoons without any guilt. He had sat in the green leather chair across from Gerald's desk and listened carefully while the older man explained, slowly and precisely, what Raymond Pierce had left behind. The cotton candy stall. The small house Nolan rented from himself without knowing it. The fairground land that 3 generations of Pierce men had quietly held onto through every economic shift and development boom. And the controlling interest in Pierce Holdings, a property trust his father had built over 40 years under a series of holding companies so layered and carefully structured that almost no one in Millbrook had ever connected them back to a quiet man who liked gardening and crossword puzzles. Nolan had sat with this information for 3 days before the fair opened. He had not told anyone. Not Mrs. Tatum. Not his brother in Baton Rouge. Not Rosie, because Rosie was 7 and deserved to keep being 7 for as long as possible. He had gone to his cotton candy stall on Wednesday morning and set up the display tower and waited for the day to begin, because that was what he knew how to do. And then a woman in a cream blazer had walked into his stall and called his life's work a hobby, and something in him had settled into a very quiet, very patient resolve. Vivienne Hart did not go back to the fairground that afternoon. She went back to the temporary office space her company had rented above the hardware store on Millbrook's Main Street, changed into a spare blazer from her travel bag, and got back to work. She had property surveys to review, contractor estimates to cross-reference, and a call with her investors scheduled for 4 o'clock that she could not afford to stumble through. But the cotton candy man stayed in her mind in a way she could not fully explain or dismiss. It was not guilt. Vivienne did not spend a great deal of time feeling guilty. It was something more practical than that. Something about the way he had spoken to her. Most people, when Vivienne used a certain tone of voice, either crumbled or escalated. They apologized excessively or they got defensive and loud. The man at the stall had done neither. He had just looked at her with those steady, dark eyes and said what he meant, quietly, and then turned back to his work. That was unusual. Unusual things made Vivienne pay attention. "Harriet," she said, without looking up from her survey map. "Already ahead of you," Harriet said from across the room, her eyes on her tablet screen. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say find out who owns the fairground land and also possibly find out who that cotton candy man is." Vivienne looked up. "How long have you worked for me?" 6 years, 2 months, and approximately 14 days. "Run the search." Harriet was already running it. She had started the moment they left the fairground, because 6 years had taught her to read the particular quality of Vivienne's silences, and the silence on the walk back had been the kind that meant something had snagged on a corner of her mind and would not let go. The property records took 20 minutes to pull. The corporate registry took another 30. And then Harriet sat very still at her desk for a long moment, reading the same paragraph 3 times. "Vivienne," she said. You need to see this." The name on the document. Vivienne crossed the room and looked at the tablet screen Harriet held up. It was a corporate registry document, dense with legal language and cross-referenced holding company names, the kind of document that was deliberately difficult to read quickly. But at the top, in clean black type, was the name of the controlling interest holder of Pierce Holdings. Nolan Raymond Pierce. Below it, a summary of assets held in trust. The fairground land. The Eastern Development Corridor. For adjacent parcels that Vivienne's entire project depended on. Every single piece of land that Hart Property Group needed to break ground on the Millbrook complex. All of it. His. Vivienne read the document twice. Then she set the tablet down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. "He's not a cotton candy vendor," Harriet said, unnecessarily. "He's both," Vivienne said. "He sells cotton candy and he owns half the town. Technically closer to a third." Harriet. "Sorry." Vivienne walked to the window and looked out at Millbrook's Main Street below. A group of children were walking toward the fairground with their parents, clutching tickets, pointing at the Ferris wheel visible above the rooftops. She watched them without really seeing them, her mind moving quickly through the architecture of what she had just learned. She had stood in front of this man and called his stall a hobby. She had said, directly to his face, that the area needed to be cleared before construction began. She had said this to the man who owned the area. Who could, with a single instruction to Gerald Pierce's law office, stop her entire project from moving forward indefinitely. How long has his family owned that land? She asked. Harriet checked her notes. 63 years. His grandfather purchased it in 1961. It passed to his father, Raymond Pierce, in 1989. Raymond died 14 months ago. Nolan inherited everything. And he's been running a cotton candy stall. Every summer fair for the past 4 years, according to the town business registry. Before that he was in architectural design. He left that career after his wife passed away. Rosie would have been about 3 at the time. Vivienne turned from the window. Something moved across her face too quickly to name, and then it was gone, replaced by the composed, forward-moving expression she wore like a second skin. Set up a meeting, she said. He's already declined 3 meeting requests from our acquisitions team. Those were from our acquisitions team. This one will be from me, personally. Harriet made the note. And what exactly is the approach? Given that you did tell him his livelihood was a hobby and that his stall needed to be removed. I'm aware of what I said, Harriet. Just making sure we're working from the same information. Vivienne picked up her blazer from the back of her chair. The replacement one, not the ruined one. The ruined one was in a bag in the corner and she had not decided yet whether it was salvageable. The approach, she said, is honest. I sit across from him, and I make him an offer that makes sense. And if he says no? Vivienne paused at the door. In her professional life, she had very rarely encountered a no that could not eventually be moved. Land deals were logic puzzles. Everyone had a number. Everyone had something they needed. But she thought about the man at the stall. The way he had looked at Rosie when he told Vivienne not to use that word in front of her. The way he had turned back to rebuilding his display tower without waiting for an apology she had not offered. Then I'll have to figure out what he actually wants, she said. And that might be more complicated than a number. She left the office and walked down the stairs into the warm afternoon, and for the first time in a very long time, Vivienne Hart was not entirely sure she was the most prepared person walking into a situation. That feeling was new. She did not like it. But somewhere beneath the discomfort, in a place she rarely visited, something else stirred. Something that felt almost like respect. Vivienne did not sleep well. She told herself it was the unfamiliar mattress in the rented apartment above the hardware store, or the distant sound of the fair's closing music drifting through the window long after midnight, or the 3 cups of coffee she had consumed after 6 in the evening. She told herself all of these things with great conviction while staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, and none of them were true. The truth was simpler and less comfortable. She kept seeing the moment. Not the cotton candy falling, not the ruined blazer, not any of the dramatic visual details her mind could have chosen to replay. She kept seeing the exact second after she had used the word hobby. The way Nolan's expression had not collapsed into hurt or risen into anger, but had simply shifted, like a door closing in a quiet house, and how he had looked at his daughter instead of at her, as if protecting Rosie from what had just been said was more important than responding to the person who said it. Vivienne had been in business for 15 years. She had sat across from men who shouted and men who threatened and men who smiled while they tried to take things from her. She had learned to read people the way other people read maps, quickly and practically, looking for landmarks that told her where she was and where she needed to go. She could not read Nolan Pierce. That was the problem. By 6 in the morning she gave up on sleep entirely, made coffee, and sat at the small table by the window with the property documents spread in front of her. She read through them again, not looking for new information this time, but trying to understand the shape of what she was dealing with. 63 years of land ownership, passed through 3 generations without ever being developed or sold. His grandfather had bought it when Millbrook was a different kind of town. His father had held it through every offer and every boom and every moment when selling would have made financial sense. And Nolan had inherited it 14 months ago, just over a year after losing his wife, with a 3-year-old daughter and a cotton candy stall and apparently no interest in doing anything with it except being there. Vivienne pressed her fingers against her temple and looked out the window at the empty morning street below. She had built her career on understanding what land was worth. She was very good at it. But she was beginning to suspect that Nolan Pierce was operating on a completely different understanding of the word worth, and that her usual tools were not going to be enough. Cecilia Monroe tells the truth. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock at a small coffee shop called Birdhouse on the corner of Mill and 2nd Street. Vivienne arrived 7 minutes early, which was as close to on time as she ever got, and found that Nolan was already there. He was not alone. Sitting across from him was a woman in her mid-40s with warm brown skin, natural silver-streaked hair, and the calm, steady presence of someone who had weathered difficult things and come through them without bitterness. She was drinking tea and laughing at something Nolan had just said when Vivienne walked in, and she did not stop laughing immediately the way most people did when someone in expensive shoes entered a room. Nolan stood when he saw Vivienne. He was wearing a simple gray shirt, dark trousers, clean shoes. No tie, no blazer, no performance of formality. Just himself, put together and unhurried. "Ms. Hart," he said. "This is Cecilia Monroe. She was my wife's closest friend. I hope you don't mind that she joined us." Vivienne minded slightly, because she had prepared for a one-on-one conversation and Cecilia Monroe looked like the kind of person who noticed everything and forgot nothing. But she sat down and said she did not mind at all, because she was also the kind of person who knew when being flexible was more useful than being rigid. "Rosie is with Mrs. Tatum this morning," Nolan said, settling back into his chair. "She's probably already eaten her weight in buttered toast." "She's a lovely child," Cecilia said to Vivienne, in a tone that was entirely friendly and somehow also entirely informative. As if she were saying, "That child matters enormously, please remember that while we talk." A young server came and took Vivienne's order. When he left, Vivienne opened the folder she had brought and began to set out the proposal her team had prepared. Updated land valuation. Revised offer figures. A community benefit clause she had added herself at midnight, which included funding for local businesses and a designated public space in the development's design. Nolan looked at the documents without touching them. "You did extra work on this," he said. "I did." "The community clause. That wasn't in the original offers my family received." "It wasn't. I added it." He looked at her then, with that same steady, unreadable attention. "Why?" Vivienne had prepared an answer for this question that was professional and reasonable and backed by solid reasoning about community relations and long-term project sustainability. She opened her mouth to give that answer, and then, inexplicably, she did not give it. "Because I said something cruel in front of your daughter," she said instead. "And I have been thinking about it since it happened, and I wanted you to know that I am aware of it." The table was quiet for a moment. Cecilia looked at her tea. Nolan looked at Vivienne. "That's not a small thing to say," he said. "I know. Most people in your position would just increase the number and hope I didn't bring it up." "I considered that," Vivienne said honestly. "It seemed like the wrong approach with you specifically." Cecilia made a small sound that might have been a laugh. What Nolan carried. What happened next was not what Vivienne had planned for. She had planned for negotiation. For position and counterposition, for the careful architecture of a deal built from mutual interest. She had not planned for Cecilia Monroe to set down her tea and begin talking about a woman named Diane. Diane Pierce had grown up in Millbrook. She had met Nolan when they were both 24, at a community architecture project on the town's eastern edge, the same land that Vivienne now wanted to develop. Diane had been the one who convinced Nolan to take his father's advice and hold on to the land, even when the money from selling it would have made their early years together considerably easier. She had said, Cecilia told Vivienne quietly, that some things were worth more kept than sold. That a family's claim to a place was not a transaction. That Rosie, who was not yet born but already dreamed of, deserved to have roots that went somewhere deep. Diane had died of an illness that moved fast and gave very little warning. Rosie was 3 years and 2 months old. Nolan had closed his architecture practice, taken Rosie out of daycare, and spent a full year simply being present for his daughter in every way he could manage. The cotton candy stall had been Diane's idea, actually, a summer project she had suggested 2 years before she got sick, something about the fair being the most purely happy place she knew. Nolan had built it after she was gone, as a way of bringing Rosie somewhere that felt like her mother's kind of joy. Vivienne listened to all of this without interrupting. She was very still in her chair. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Cecilia said, looking at Vivienne directly. "I'm telling you because Nolan won't tell you himself, and I think you're someone who makes better decisions when you have the full picture." "Cecilia," Nolan said, with the patience of someone who had accepted long ago that Cecilia Monroe would always say the true thing regardless of the occasion. "She came prepared," Cecilia said simply. "She deserves the context." The decision. Vivienne looked at the proposal document still spread on the table between them. The numbers were good. The community clause was genuine. The project was well designed and would bring real economic activity to a town that could use it. She believed in the project. She had not stopped believing in it. But she understood now that she had walked into Millbrook with the assumption that everything had a price and that her job was simply to find it. She had not considered the possibility that some things were not priced at all. That they were just held, the way you hold something that belonged to someone you loved. "What would it take," she said to Nolan, slowly, "for you to feel that this land was being honored rather than replaced?" Nolan looked at her for a long moment. It was the first question she had asked. She realized that was not about her project. It was about him. "The fair stays," he said. "Every summer. Guaranteed in the contract, not just promised in a clause. The eastern corner of the development, the part closest to where my grandfather's original boundary markers still stand, becomes a permanent green space named for my wife. And the community benefit funding goes directly to local business grants, not to a general fund that disappears into administration." Vivienne looked at the documents. She mentally restructured 3 sections of the proposal, recalculated 2 cost lines, and identified exactly which investor conversation she would need to have and how she would frame it. "I can do all of that," she said. Nolan looked at her steadily. "You didn't hesitate." "I didn't need to. It's fair." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not with music or weather or any of the signs that stories use to mark a turning point. Just a quiet shift, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. "The space," Vivienne said carefully. "The one named for your wife. What was she like?" Nolan was quiet for a moment. Cecilia watched him with the gentle attention of someone who has sat with a person through their hardest seasons. "She noticed everything," he said finally. "Small things. She would have noticed the popcorn in your hair before I did." He paused. "She also would have told me to offer you a free bag after the collision instead of making a joke about the caramel coating." Vivienne felt something move through her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. It was not pity. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The feeling of seeing another person clearly for the first time. "She sounds like someone worth remembering," Vivienne said. "She is," Nolan said. "She was." They signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon in Gerald Pierce's office, with Cecilia as witness and Rosie sitting in the corner of the room drawing horses on the back of a legal pad she had found on the desk. When it was done, Nolan shook Vivienne's hand, and she shook his, and neither of them said anything grand or summarizing about the moment. Outside, the fair was still running. The Ferris wheel turned above the tree line. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a brass band played something warm and unhurried, and the smell of cotton candy drifted through the afternoon air like a reminder that some things, if you are careful with them, can be both simple and lasting at the same time. Vivienne stood on the pavement outside the lawyer's office and looked up at the Ferris wheel for a moment before she got into her car. She had come to Millbrook to acquire something. She was leaving with something she had not anticipated. Not land, not a signed agreement, not a professional victory. Just the beginning of understanding that the people who seem to be in your way are sometimes the ones holding the door open, if only you would stop long enough to notice. Rosie's voice drifted from inside the office, asking Gerald if she could keep the legal pad because the horses were not finished yet. Vivienne smiled. She got in her car. She drove back toward the fair, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she was not on her phone.
Thank you for watching my YouTube channel Noha Narrative. To my amazing viewers in the United States, your support truly means the world to me. Every story shared on this channel is true and personally written by me. If the story made you feel something and gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious, stay strong and keep learning from real life stories. Thank you so much.